I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Feeling.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable. This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. This is... Would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the biographies.
Really?
You didn't know that?
I mean, I thought that I would be loud.
I mean, you are loud, but I'm a much louder person, I feel like.
I just think that, I don't know. So it's funny at work, we have like 25 people in a pretty small space, and there's no carpet or fabric or anything in there.
Ooh.
And now that Tegan started...
Who's Tegan?
You remember Tegan from Andy's team?
Oh, dark hair?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, who sat behind us, right?
I hired her.
Oh, look at you. I liked Tegan. She was always really nice.
Yeah, so she started, and then somebody else started, and they are both really... They project when they're on the phone. And we are having trouble because everyone can hear. I mean, it sounds like a call center when we're on the phone. And Tegan and I were like, well, wait, what did we have in the office at Conga? Carpet. And then we had like a thing that was about this high.
And that would keep the
and
noise
that was
down
muffled. Yeah, it did so much that you didn't realize it was doing, I think. And so they are like, it's a problem. They're supposed to be making a ton of calls. They're RSMs. They've got 500 accounts. Like they got to be call, go. And sorry, CSMs it's retail success manager. Anyway, long story short, we're having a little audio issue at the office. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it'd be any worse than me next to you at an office because I projected.
I know, but I sat next to you and I don't remember you projecting quite as much as
really?
Tegan and Jeannie also. She like... These women need to be like orators.
That's
like they need to go and like give public speeches.
This is one of the first times outside of Jamaica that I've heard somebody that is louder than me. Seriously, like I've heard so many times throughout my life, you are the loudest person that I've ever met.
I mean, you're not quiet.
No.
I don't know. It's pretty loud. But then again, you are always surrounded, even right now, there's carpet on the ground. Like there is absorption happening.
Muffling?
Yeah. This is a concrete floor. Tables that are really, really big, and they have like their dry erase surface so that you can write on them. And nothing, none of this. Like you even have a curtain. Like there's nothing in there. The only fabric around them is like, it's what's on our bodies. Our chairs are even like those meshy kind of chairs. Like it's not like this where it's like fabric cushion.
So it's just an echo chamber, basically.
It is an echo chamber.
It worse and worse and worse and worse.
Anyway, they'll figure it out.
Well, right on. Well, how you doing?
Good. Feeling a lot better after
last week's sickness.
Yeah, I had the wiggle, as my brother calls it.
Ugh, I don't even know how you would come to that term.
He just calls it the wiggle.
The wiggle. Is it because you...
It's like, I don't know, you got phlegm, it's wiggling. I don't know.
Huh.
Ugh.
Okay.
You get that tickle in your throat, the wiggle.
The wiggle. I've never heard it called the wiggle before, but I guess that's kind of fun.
I don't know that it's a thing. It's what Bill calls it.
Well, let me ask you then. Do you remember what we talked about last time? Do you remember where we ended off?
Refresh me. Refresh everyone.
Refresh everyone. So the last time we left off, Mabel had gone down to Santa Fe.
Yes.
And then had met some people via Maurice Stern, her husband. And through kind of a chance, I don't want to be around you people anymore, she said, let's go down to Taos. Right?
Yes.
So then they go down to Taos, hang out there for a little while. She decides she wants to rent a place. And then where we ended last time was when she first met the man from her dreams, supposedly.
First met, air quotes, maybe second or third met.
Her one day to be, not quite yet, husband, Tony Lujan. Is that ringing a bell?
Yes, it is. As soon as you said that, I was like, oh yeah, now I remember. I don't know. It's hard to remember things these days.
That's okay. Now, a couple of extra details to go along with that is that when she did get into Taos, she went to a man named Doc Martin, who is the physician for the town. He had directed her to a man named Mr. Mansby, who we'll talk about a little bit more in this episode, who she actually rented the house from. And then again, from there, she met Tony Lujan. Now, before we get going again, I would like to say that throughout this series, and increasingly over this episode and the next, the term Indian is going to be used for historical quotes and titles. I am trying my best to otherwise use the terms Native American or tribespeople, although, from what I understand, I have done some research on this, there are many tribespeople of North America that do actually prefer the term Indian to describe themselves. So really, this is me just saying, please, anybody out there, understand I'm not trying to say any verbiage that is for offense. I'm trying my best to keep it as PC and kosher as I possibly can. So just wanted to say that again because we're going to get heavier into some of this stuff in this episode and the next.
Sounds good.
Alrighty, so let's get into it. So Tony Lujan was a full-blooded member of the North American Tiwa tribe who had previously spent time on the east coast of America as part of a traveling Wild West show. Though Mabel does not mention this part of Tony's past, it does seem that Tony had learned a thing or two from his time on the East Coast, both about street smarts and maybe a little sadly, what white Americans at the time wanted to see from Native Americans. So in contrast to many other tribespeople in the area who wore fairly plain clothes on a day-to-day basis, think like, in modern terms, your everyday, pants, jeans, shirt, but for traditional Native American tribes, that's what most people would wear. Tony would rarely be seen outside of his spotless white sheets, often with elaborate accessories and a perfect set of braids interlaced with ribbon draping down each shoulder. So very, very traditional looking guy.
So was he doing more like specialty ceremonial garb to kind of...
No,
he was doing... I'm sorry, I'm mixed up. Is he just being kind of like more...
So I think where the idea that I get from Tony is that because he had spent more time around Western civilization, he got the idea in his head fairly, to be honest, that white people of America had an image in their brain of what Native Americans should look like and what they should be. Mm-hmm. So to him, I think that's mostly what it was. So he would wear what you would consider in your mind, if you were to think of like an old Western movie, he would wear more or less stereotypical clothing.
Okay, so he was not hamming it up, but he was like wearing more...
I think he was leaning into it.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, I think that's the best way to say it. That's what I was trying
to... So you're saying... So to me, that seems like, okay, on a normal day, I may not wake up and put on like my beaded, something nicer that's more colorful and ornate if I'm just like going about my business.
Tony would.
Yeah. And so people don't normally add all of that extra like feathers and flair, and he was doing that purposefully to kind of be like, yes.
Well, that is definitely speculation on my part as to the reason why he did it, but it does seem to be the case.
Or maybe he was more of a traditionalist, and he was like, you know what, you guys are slacking off, folks.
It is entirely possible that he just liked looking good. It does seem, though, that because he had spent this time in this Wild West show on the East Coast, and he had interacted with a lot of these people, and I think he saw the writing on the wall. I think he saw that people were going to be coming out west in droves, never stopping, and that he was like, hey, if I'm going to be a part of this world somehow, I need to set myself apart. That's just the feeling that I get. Cool. I don't know that for sure. That's, again, just the impression I get. Now, this information about Tony's past, of course, comes from Maurice Stern, who seemed to view Tony's sense of style as a negative. I, on the other hand, just think that Tony did like to look good, as we were just talking about. I also think the same sort of sentiment regarding clothing and style could be said of Mabel. So it seems like this does come from a place of prejudice from Maurice's part, and almost definitely from a point of jealousy. Now, there is one more anecdote from Maurice's perspective in regard to his early encounters with Tony Lujan. Now, one evening, Maurice and Mabel hosted a small party in their rented adobe home and decided to hire 3 Native American performers to come sing and dance for the guests. Now, Maurice decided to turn in early that night, but before doing so, pulled Tony off to the side. He gave Tony $20, saying that 10 was for Tony for not only performing, but for organizing the other 2 performers. And the other 10 was to be divided amongst the other 2. So, $10 for Tony, $5 for the other 2. Okay. Well, the next day, Maurice Stern was walking along one of Taos' dirt streets in the town center and saw one of the 2 native performers who had been at his house the previous night. Maurice tried to casually greet him, probably by tipping his hat or nodding his head, but the native man snubbed him, didn't even make eye contact. Maurice doubled back and caught up to him, asking if he had done something wrong to offend him, The native man, quite fairly, told Maurice that he was upset because he did not get paid for the previous night's performance. Maurice was indignant and told the man that he had, in fact, paid Tony already and instructed him on how to share the pay. According to Maurice Stern, the native man said, quote, "Tony no good," and said that Tony had never shared any money with him. Later that day, Maurice arrived back at his house to find Mabel preparing to go on a ride with Tony, going horseback. Something Tony and Mabel often did together, by the way, because Tony was very impressed by Mabel's riding, because if you remember, we mentioned earlier in the series, yeah, she was an equestrian. She broke horses, so when she got out there, he was like, holy moly, this girl can ride a horse, and he was very, very impressed.
She ain't scared.
They would do this regularly. So Maurice gets back, and he presses Tony on the issue of payment with his fellow performers. Tony told Maurice that he was arrogant and rode off, to which Maurice shouted something to the effect of, "Yeah, and don't come back." Mabel was so embarrassed that all she could do was shoot an angry look at Maurice and retreat inside. So a little shady. It's weird. It's, I'm not sure how to take this one. This is one of those where it's like, you got grifted for sure, but it's also one of those where I'm like, Tony, what are you doing? You're grifting your own people. Like, this one, I don't know. It's a weird one.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe he's like a $20 in the hand, like
right.
I'm not sure.
Just pleading ignorant. And he's going to tell his friends, nope, nobody else.
It was pro bono.
Yeah, right. No, anyways. Now, beyond this, the winter of 1917 was passing along nicely in northern New Mexico as Mabel busied herself writing letters to friends on the East Coast, asking for them to come visit her in her new home. The only thing that really seemed to put a damper on Mabel's mood was the in-house cook she hired, a young girl from Taos of Mexican descent. Basically, she said she hated her cooking. And by the way, I think this is insane because I've been down there and the cooking is amazing. So I have a feeling that this is very much Mabel being like, I want steak, and they're making enchiladas, and she just didn't understand how to take that. So that I found annoying.
She also has had a lot of the, she lived in Italy, so maybe she's like more partial to French and Italian food.
I need my perfect pasta.
Yeah, I mean, maybe butter is her number one favorite ingredient.
Whose isn't? You know what I mean? Paula Deen had it right on that one.
French food is.
Now, Mabel was so displeased with the young girl's cooking that she begged her friends Bobby Jones and Andrew Dasberg to bring a good cook with them when they came to Taos. So sure enough, when the two arrived in Taos, they brought with them a hefty German chef with a well-rounded resume.
And belly.
Almost definitely. Now, being from Germany himself, Andrew Dasberg was particularly fascinated with the war in Europe, so he and Maurice, along with Bobby Jones, spent hours talking about strategy, military positioning, and carefully plotting maps with little pins to show the progress of the war as they read the reports through the newspapers. Mabel also found herself spending quite a lot of time at the Taos Pueblo, as she had begun a knitting circle and was teaching the native girls how to knit. Now, a little bit of time passed, and one night, as the group sat around a fire talking, there was a knock at the door. Mabel opened it to find a retired mounted police officer and a local inspector. They were here at the house because they had been tipped off that Mabel's group were a bunch of German sympathizers who were plotting the German invasion from this house, as they had received large boxes and shipments, presumably of ammunition, storing them in the barn out back, and that they were planning an uprising with the local tribes to overthrow the government from within because New Mexico was a perfect gateway from Mexico into the United States.
That's hysterical.
Yes.
I mean, probably not that hysterical in that moment when Mabel opened the door, but...
Now, sometimes being Mabel Dodge really helps. She was having none of it and spat back that the shipments were food. She said that they had been visiting local tribes to teach them how to knit. Her friends were a bunch of war nerds, and that if these two goofball officers didn't leave her alone, she would send word to her stepfather, Rear Admiral Reeder of the U.S. Navy, or one of her other relatives who were majors and colonels in the Army. This seemed to shut the two officers up pretty quick, as they apologized for disturbing them and retreated into the night with their tails between their legs. This was not enough, however, as Mabel wrote to Washington demanding an investigation to her accusations, and as it turned out, there was something of a spy in their midst.
Really? I was wondering, where did these harebrained accusations come from?
Apparently, For weeks, Maurice and Andrew Dasberg had been hearing soft scratches from the fireplace at odd times. The two had even jokingly said to one another, "Ha ha ha, what if it's like somebody up in the fireplace listening, ha ha ha." But apparently, their suspicions were correct. Mr. Manby had been crawling up onto the roof of their house to listen in on their conversations and had formed a conspiracy theory that Mabel was hosting a bunch of German spies to plot the overthrow of the United States government. Remember again, Andrew Dasberg was originally from Germany. They brought along a German chef, and even Maurice Stern had an odd accent due to his Russian birth. Somehow, formal charges were never brought against Mr. Manby, so he was left to awkwardly avoid eye contact and meekly avoid speaking to Mabel and the group moving forward.
Oh my gosh, how weird.
Bizarre, right? Now, I'm about to tell you a little something else that's going to illuminate this entire situation.
Okay.
As an absolutely fascinating aside, Mr. Manby, whose full name was Arthur Rockford Manby, could probably be the subject for a whole episode of a true crime podcast. Quick story. After moving to America from Yorkshire, England, and eventually settling in northern New Mexico, Arthur Manby got involved with a gang called the Masterson's Militia and a political enforcement group called the Santa Fe Ring. He killed a man named Dan Griffin, who he was involved in a land argument with, but got off in court due to the Santa Fe Ring paying for a high-priced lawyer and pleading self-defense. He was almost kicked out of New Mexico altogether at one point due to his affiliation with these gangs, but eventually moved to Taos. There, he pursued mining claims with 3 other partners named Wilkerson, Ferguson, and Stone. But when Stone wouldn't go along with some crooked plans that Arthur had cooked up, he mysteriously washed up on the banks of the Rio Grande without a head.
Oh my gosh.
This conveniently put Arthur Manby in a better position of ownership in the mine. Arthur was also a pedophile, known to have aggressively pursued at least one girl who was just 14 years old, and later marrying a 17-year-old girl when he was 48. She divorced him after just 1 year, citing, quote, extreme cruelty. Years later, when his old partner Wilkerson came to town for a visit, seemingly flush with cash, he too disappeared. A maid, employed by Arthur Manby, later admitted to witnessing him and some friends carry Wilkerson's body into a cart in the middle of the night. Manby later formed a secret society called the U.S. Secret and Civil Service Society Self-Serving Branch, or the USCSSSB, that he claimed was inspired by the KKK, and in which he initiated members in a bizarre Masonic-style ritual that included various chants and a demonstration in which Mr. Manby would act out a beheading, shooting, and head stomping of any member that wanted to leave the society post-initiation. The society really just amassed to a murder-for-hire group, with Manby collecting the majority of the profit. There is quite a lot more to his story. But eventually, Arthur Manby would be found by a U.S. Marshal dead in his home on July 23rd, 1929, his body inside on a cot in his bedroom, and his head outside being chewed on by his own dogs.
Yeah!
In a true testament to his reputation and standing around town, within the day, the coroner's jury would rule his death natural causes. Many also believe that the body was not even that of Arthur Manby, and that he faked his own death. Wild story. And this is the first person that Mabel rented a house from in Taos.
Okay. So natural causes is karma natural causes?
Right? I don't know what they were thinking.
I mean, interesting, the whole faking of the death, because that would like kind of track if the dogs had destroyed.
Right. Because it's an odd one, because you kind of think about it and you're like, okay, his old partner, he was beheaded and found that way. Mm-hmm. So you're like, okay, obviously that was Arthur. But then in his death, you could go either way, right? It's either, oh, somebody did this as revenge, as the exact, like, tit for tat, basically, or Arthur had an MO.
I have another theory.
What's that?
What if there was someone above the 3 of those guys?
Mm.
And he liked beheading people?
There could be
Or she liked
a
beheading
mysterious, unknown beheader of the Southwest at the time. This is
people.
possible.
The New Mexican beheader. Yeah,
Okay,
my
that's
face, this is a podcast, but like my face just kept being like, my eyebrows kept going up and up and up. And it was like, this is hurting my forehead, how high these eyebrows are going. So yeah.
How far can I take this?
Wow. I was like, but wait, there's more.
All right, well, now back to Mabel. Winter was coming to an end and Easter was fast approaching. Since she arrived in Taos, Mabel had been hearing rumors around town that a secret society of penitent Christians called the Mexican Penitentes held a secret yearly parade through the desert in which they recreated Jesus Christ's walk to the hill of Calvary. Along the way, the penitentes were said to chant and pause occasionally to whip themselves in solidarity. Naturally, this was a sight that Mabel just had to see, despite knowing that this was a sacred ritual that these people wanted to perform in private.
I'm sorry. I am picturing Monty Python and the Holy Grail right now.
100%.
Yeah. I mean,
Yes.
I can't. It's like exactly what is in my brain.
When they're smacking their heads with the boards.
Yeah. Like all of that. Yeah.
Totally. So, she, Maurice, Andrew Dasberg, and Bobby Jones set out into the desert on Good Friday to hunt for the penitentes. They shivered through the night, but eventually, out in the distance, they saw lights. A group of 20 or 30 men made their way through the night, chanting and pausing occasionally to perform representations of the Stations of the Cross as the low thud of knotted whips tore at their backs and echoed through the cold night air. Mabel said that once she was able to see the procession, she felt ashamed for having spied on such an intimate and personal ritual.
I was kind of feeling this a little bit. I was like,
Absolutely.
like, I get that you may think it's like bizarre, but also it's religious and
Agreed.
you respect that, I guess.
So once she saw everything and started to feel her little bit of shame, she pushed the group to leave for home, and that was the conclusion of the night. However, once again, Maurice Stern has a very different account of the events that unfolded that night. According to him, the group fumbled around in the darkness for some time and never found anything, except for another group of visiting artists that wanted to catch a glimpse of the penitentes too.
Okay, well,
And that was it.
who knows what actually happened?
Who knows what actually happened? I also would say that it is entirely possible that since Maurice Stern and Mabel were only here together for like a year or so, it's entirely possible that Mabel did it another year with
she
other
might,
people
and then just mixed
up
up
the
what
stories.
year it was, yeah.
So it's entirely possible that you're right, that Maurice is just
They're both
like that.
right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't know. Now, during this time, Mabel had really started to get to know the Tiwa tribe of the Taos Pueblo and started to become increasingly influenced by their aesthetics, culture, and lifestyle. In accordance with this, Mabel cut her hair from a traditional bob style to what's known as a Dutch bob, which is cut further back to expose the ears, which was more similar to the native hairstyles. Maurice really did not like this look, by the way.
Oh, Maurice.
Which, like, who cares? Maurice, you're no prized piece, but whatever. With this new haircut, she also became fond of tying her hair back in little ribbons, kind of like a headband, think Alice in Wonderland. And one morning, while wearing a purple ribbon, Tony commented, quote, "Nice color." Tony likes purple.
Tony likes purple.
Now, that was all Mabel needed to hear, and she rushed to town as soon as she could to buy a purple shawl that she would wear every day moving forward, draped in a fashion to mimic the girls at the Pueblo. With the increased visits came an increase in the time spent with Tony, his wife Calendaria, and their extended family. Tony's mother lived next door with her daughter, son-in-law John Archuleta, and all of the Archuleta children. An exact number is not known, but it was said to be a big family. Tony loved being an uncle to all his nieces and nephews, but was particularly fond of his niece, Paulita. Now, there is some conflicting information on Paulita's name, as Mabel refers to her as Marina in her book Winter in Taos, but is referred to as Paulita in her biography and many of the other personal letters. So I'm assuming that in Winter in Taos, she was trying to just protect some identities, and so instead of Paulita, she changed it to Marina. But again, in all of the official writings that I've read, letters and whatnot, it is Paulita, is Tony's niece's name.
Okay.
Now, as Mabel tells the story, one morning, she came to the Pueblo where Tony took her to see Paulita, saying that she had caught a cold. Mabel could immediately see that the illness was far more severe than a cold and asked why the doctor hadn't come by. Tony said that the doctor only went to the schoolhouse twice a week and that the tribe had to go there to get medicine. The doctor never came to the pueblo. Additionally, a medicine man would be coming to treat Paulita soon. Mabel went back to Tony's house and sat around the fire all morning missing Paulita and thinking to herself that everyone else seems to have just forgotten about her. The next day, she came back to the pueblo to find Tony outside with his face in his hands. Paulita was now gravely ill, breathing fast and heavy, her head darting back and forth, looking off into a distance that wasn't there. Mabel insisted that a doctor come treat her, so she rushed off to the schoolhouse to find the government-assigned doctor to the tribespeople, Dr. Bergmans. Dr. Bergmans was, apparently, off-put by her intrusion, and it took some convincing for him to abandon his current task, but he finally relented and followed Mabel back to Paulita. Upon seeing her and giving her a quick diagnosis, he gave her some aspirin, said that's all he could do, and got up to leave. Before he could go, Mabel stopped him and asked what Paulita had. Double pneumonia, Dr. Bergman said, and walked away. Mabel said that was the full extent of his treatment. No surprise, as Tony had told Mabel that not a single child at the pueblo had survived birth under Dr. Bergman's care. Paulita died later that night.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't sound like she was going to be making it.
At least, that's how Mabel wrote the story later in her book, Winter in Taos. When this event actually happened, Mabel wrote an angry letter to a man named George Creel, who was in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington at the time. By the way, that was the official title. That is what I'm going to be using moving forward. So again, back to the word Indian. But anyway, we do still have this letter, by the way, that she wrote to George Creel, this angry letter that's expressing this. So we know the situation. In the letter, Mabel described a completely different series of events, and this is Mabel writing to him, so in her own words, right? So she wrote of a completely different series of events leading up to Paulita's death. In the letter, Mabel said she learned of Paulita's illness on a Sunday, and by Monday had a bad cough. By Tuesday, Paulita was very ill, so Mabel had Tony call Dr. Bergmans, who was at the pueblo within an hour.
Okay.
Dr. Bergmans diagnosed pneumonia, but it was Mabel who fought back and insisted Paulita had, quote, congestion of the lungs. Dr. Bergmans prescribed cathartic, which is a laxative, instructed that she take a lukewarm bath, and left a medicine with instructions that it be taken every 3 hours. Mabel says she then stayed until nightfall and then left the medicine with Paulita's mother. She lastly claims that due to Paulita's mother's poor English skills, she didn't understand the instructions, and as a result, Paulita died. Because of this letter, Dr. Bergmans was investigated by the BIA. The report is fairly long, but I'd like to read a few highlights that will paint a pretty accurate picture of what the BIA found. So we're just going to go through some bullet points here, and I'll read it in a slight affectation so you know what I'm reading in the voice of a man from the BIA. I find that Mrs. Stern has been in Taos since December 1917. She cannot say, as she says, to have become friends with the Indians and have a good chance to see their life in the short time she has been there. The Indians of the Pueblo do not know her. The only Indians she is acquainted with are the ones employed around her house. Mrs. Stern states that the death rate increases under Dr. Bergmans' care and that he is losing all the babies in the Indian Pueblo. This statement is not borne out by records of this office. Of the Indian deaths during the past year, only 2 were under age 20. The Indians tell me no white doctor has ever been present at the birth of an Indian child. It is their custom not to have any men present when a child is born, not even the father. After a thorough investigation of the matters complained of by Mrs. Stern, I find that her charges against Dr. Bergmans are entirely without foundation. Dr. Bergmans not only lives up to his contract, but that he visits the Indians whenever he is called. His contract only calls for 2 visits to the school each week. The Indians are well pleased with the service rendered by Dr. Bergmans. Mrs. Stern states that she followed out the doctor's orders, but Paulita's mother says that she did not give her any of the medicine left by the doctor, nor give her a sponge bath. The mother says Mrs. Stern did not do anything. Now, it is entirely possible that statistics were not being reported accurately, and it's also possible that the investigation into Dr. Bergman's had some bias on the part of the investigator, but I do think it's safe to say that Mabel was not quite the heroic advocate to Paulita that she makes herself out to be in her later writings. This incident would earn Mabel a black mark with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Mabel did subsequently try to attend Paulita's burial, but was turned away by the tribe, explaining that they had their own private ways of burial and mourning to which she was not allowed.
I don't know. I mean...
Complicated, right?
Yeah, a little bit complicated. I mean, the other thing is that if Tony was, or whoever said that the doctor had lost all the, babies or whatever,
right,
it could be that a combination of all those stories. Maybe the doctor wasn't allowed at the birth, but then he could have been making suggestions and providing care that could help the babies after they were born, and then he wasn't doing any of that.
It's possible, right? I don't know. It
definitely doesn't seem like a great time to be born in the Southwest. Let me just say that.
No. Also, remember, this is. I was surprised that in my initial readings that didn't really mention this. New Mexico was a brand new state at this point. My numbers are going to be off here, but I want to say it was just about like somewhere between like 1908 to 1912. Pardon me. I want to say 1912 is sounding right, but I could be off by a couple years on that. But it's that new. We're like within the first decade of New Mexico even being a state. So much of this stuff too is being figured out
on
actively.
The fly, yeah.
Right. It's like, we'll get into it in a little bit, but there's a lot of things that have to do with like Native American rights that they just didn't know what to do with. They didn't know who these tribes belonged to. Were they U.S. citizens? Were they their own people? Would their own nation? Should they be? There's a lot of weird stuff that's happening there as well. So this is again to say that in this case, I don't know. It is entirely possible statistics were not being reported or just not reported accurately, and that this could have been a totally inaccurate report. I don't know.
I was having, totally somewhat related. So you're talking about this letter and this is what it is. And we have all these letters. And I was thinking like, yeah, you don't really have like letters anymore. People don't write a letter. And then it's like you find like in 200 years, no one's going to be like, oh yeah, Aubrey McCarthy wrote this letter to her congressman or something. Like maybe I guess if I did write a letter to a congressman, it would be an email. But then I was thinking, oh man, okay, but like everything we say in a text message or an email, it's like all there on some cloud somewhere. Like maybe we're going to have more information than ever before.
Oh, we will, for sure.
I mean, but it's just a interesting, I don't know. It's an interesting thought. Like, and also just taking the time to sit down and write a letter. But I guess, you write an email.
Agreed.
But if all this comes crumbling to the ground and there are no server clouds anymore, then we'll have nothing.
It doesn't matter.
Not even this podcast.
Exactly. Now, by this time, Maurice had finally started to sculpt, something Mabel had been nagging at him to do since they first met, I should say. And Maurice had begun to sculpt the bust of a local Tiwa tribesperson named Pete Marcus. One afternoon, Maurice, Mabel, Tony, and Pete decided to take a quick trip to the local hot springs where Arthur Manby had built a small shack. And as a quick aside, you can still visit those hot springs to this day, which are now named Manby Springs.
Okie dokie.
And actually, my father-in-law was telling me that apparently during the pandemic, people were going down there and like vandalizing it. So now they actually shut down the road to get there. So you can't even drive there. You have to hike there to see it. Kind of interesting. Yeah, because people are jerks. So
yeah. Stop being jerks, people.
I know. Leave nice places alone. Let them be nice for the people to enjoy. I don't get why people do that. Anyway.
Yeah.
Now the group made their way down in Tony's buggy, Mabel wearing her long purple shawl next to the oblivious Maurice. After taking their turns in the hot springs, remember, this is like 1917, so Mabel went first when the men waited off to the side. The group then made their way to some ancient rock carvings that Tony interpreted for them. When Mabel went to sit down at a nearby cliff edge, Tony tried to sneakily drop a red package into Mabel's lap, but she wasn't quick enough, and the little parcel tumbled down onto a rock below. Maurice saw the entire thing and was closest to the package, so he picked it up. He looked at Mabel, who looked surprised, and then over at Tony, who was trying to pretend like nothing had happened at all. So Maurice put the parcel in his pocket, and everyone carried on like nothing had happened. As they drove back, Tony seemingly tried to overcompensate for the awkwardness by playing tour guide Barbie and pointing out every landscape feature he could see. So that mesa, that was where we went hunting that one time with one of my friends. And that actually, remind over to the right over there, there's you see where the, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You just got to fill in the space and, things be awkward. Now, when they got back to the house that night, as Tony was getting ready to leave, he was looking at Mabel and started to re-wrap the traditional robes that he was wearing, and in doing so, made a gesture as if to wrap up Mabel with him. Again, Maurice saw the whole thing.
I mean, discretion is not his middle name, I guess. Tony, come on.
That night, after Maurice had gone to bed, Mabel immediately went to rummaging through his coat to find the gift from Tony. She discovered that it was a simple silk bag that had been scented with perfume, the same scent she was always smelling on Tony. Mabel took the silk pouch upstairs and slept with it under her pillow. The next morning, Mabel watched as Maurice hunted through his belongings to try and find the red pouch before heading over to Mabel and confronting her about it. Quote, "Is that a love token Tony was giving you?" Mabel simply laughed in response and basically said that Maurice was being juvenile.
Okay, so gaslighting him.
Exactly. Despite her acting this way, Mabel does write later on that she knew something was going on between her and Tony, and it was not just an extramarital courtship like she was used to. But despite her new feelings for Tony, it seems that she wasn't quite ready to throw in the towel with Maurice, as she still had feelings of jealousy anytime Maurice went off to a picture show at the town movie house, which she knew included some local females that she found physically threatening. According to Mabel, on one occasion, when she was out riding horses with Tony, Tony said to Mabel, quote, "I saw you before you came. I dreamed you, but you had long hair." "Yes," said Mabel. "John cut it off the first night I was here." "Too bad," said Tony. "You look nice with your hair here on each side." Mabel said, "I saw you in a dream, too, before I left New York. It made me come here." Tony simply responded by saying, "Yes," and nodding his head. Did this conversation actually happen? That's for you to decide. Mabel also writes that not long after this event, she came back from another trip with Tony but was delayed due to their car breaking down, and Mabel claims that Maurice was so furious with the incident that he struck her across the face. While this is certainly possible, it is worth noting that Mabel did also write that nobody was around to see it, and that, as we will see later, it's possible that this was stretching the truth a little bit here and relating it to a different altercation that she and Maurice had, but we'll get there in just a little bit.
Okay.
During this time, Mabel often invited a good friend from New York to stay with her in Taos named Alice Brisbane Thursby, sister to Arthur Brisbane. And if you don't know who he is, he was a journalist, speechwriter, and public relations specialist known in his time to have coached Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and John D. Rockefeller.
Ooh, very
so her brother was
pedigree.
like an orator that taught the orators how to orate. Is that the right word? I don't know.
Unknown.
Anyway, that's fun. Alice thought the world of Tony, and after several trips to Taos, proposed that Tony came back with her to New York and take a tour of the East Coast, even stopping by Washington to meet the president. Tony was open to the idea, and before long, plans were being made for Tony to accompany Alice back to New York. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Tony came to say goodbye to Mabel and had brought with him 2 wild pink roses, which are very rare, and apparently they were the first of the season. Tony had gone miles outside of town to find these roses and was exceedingly proud to bring them to Mabel as a farewell token. Mabel was indeed flattered at Tony's gift and was getting around to thanking him, but just as she was doing so, the two were illuminated by the headlights of an approaching Ford motor car. It was John Evans, just arriving after a trip into the wilderness, and Mabel rushed to greet him, dropping the pink roses into the dirt as she ran. Tony picked up the roses and began to walk away. John Evans called out to Tony to stay for dinner, but Tony refused and walked off into the sunset. The next morning, everyone gathered around the stagecoach platform to see Tony and Alice off, but Tony refused to even look at Mabel. When it came time to set off, Tony embraced his wife, Calendaria, and gave firm embraces to the other members of his household. But when Tony got to Mabel, he limply grabbed her hand without making eye contact and without saying a word. He then got into the stagecoach with Alice and headed off to the train station in Santa Fe. As a funny aside, we were talking about this on our last podcast really briefly, and I told you we were going to get here. As a really funny aside, in my research, I came across a U.S. railroad map from 1917, and on it, I noticed that some train stops had red dots for indicators, and this was like a bunch in the northeast, like around Vermont and Massachusetts, and more on the East Coast, and then as you kind of like start to get west, these red dots will fade out a little bit more, but they're still there. They were like all over the place. So I was like looking around going, what in the heck is this? So I finally locate the legend section of this huge map that I'm looking at. And there's only one indicator, and it just shows the red dots. And it says, the red dots indicate, quote, pleasure resorts.
What?
Yes. I am not exactly sure what that means.
I think
but I got a good guess. I tried to like find out if there was like, is that like an old-timey name for a casino or something? Like, am I just totally misinterpreting this?
Yeah.
But I couldn't find anything that led me to believe anything contrary to a pleasure resort, meaning a pleasure resort.
Wait, hold on a second. So like there's hot springs around there, and like I wonder if it means like going somewhere for like therapeutic
I
reasons?
was wondering, but I have found nothing that has told me what that means.
Well, or like take off pleasure if it's just resort. Like, I mean, really, they just add pleasure because you go to a resort for pleasure. Like, but putting the word pleasure on it,
But I also feel like
going.
you could probably plead ignorance if like some U.S. official saw it and was like, "What is that?" And you'd go, "Oh, that's just it's where we get massages." You know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not actually saying brothel.
But like, I mean, so brothel, or could it be like spa?
I don't know.
That's
it
interesting.
Could be.
We've got to look that up more.
It just would be so strange to me that if on a U.S. railroad map, they were listing out all the different spas that the conductors could go to.
I guess
don't know.
Maybe it also means like travel destinations, like
maybe. I don't know. I just thought it was hilarious.
Like vacation. I don't know. Interesting.
Yeah,
well, we'll have to look up more of that.
If anybody is curious, by the way, I have listed out the site that I found this map on. It's in our sources cited area of our series here. You can go to thebiographerspodcast.com if you want to look for yourself, and you can see these little pleasure resorts. So they are there.
If you know, email us, please.
I also would like to know thebiographerspodcast at gmail.com. So if you actually know what these pleasure resorts are or have some history, send it our way. I want to know. Now, in regards to Tony's trip to the East Coast, which he went to do with Alice Thursby, it seems to have been a bit of a disaster from the start. Alice Thursby said she felt something was off from the moment they left the train station, and Tony sat silent for the majority of the trip. The two were headed to Chicago, which was a more central and efficient train hub to get to New York, and met Alice's brother, Arthur. Arthur was the first to be a modern-day jerk to Tony and told Alice that Tony's traditional garb simply wouldn't do. Alice was apparently embarrassed, so she took him to a department store to pick out some clothes. Tony stayed true to himself and put together his own version of a suit consisting of green pants and jacket, a blue shirt, and what Alice described as a, quote, perfectly terrible hat.
Hey, it's not his fault. They put it in the store.
I also think it's rad that you take this Native American man and you throw him into a department store and he's like, the things that I like are completely unbiased. There is no me looking at suits and going, oh, that's the suit that I should wear because that's what society says. He was like, ooh, green.
Blue, and
oh, look at that. And oh, look at that blue. And then it was just like, I love that. It's just like completely true to who he wanted to be. I think it's great. Now, in Buffalo, all of her friends openly laughed at Tony, and New York seemed to be a source of misery for him in general. They went to the Metropolitan Museum, but he hated pretty much everything about it. They were about to head to Washington when Tony expressed his unhappiness and homesickness, so Alice gave up on the trip and sent Tony back to Taos. The moment his stagecoach arrived, Tony headed straight to Mabel and began to tell her how terrible his trip was, asking how anybody could live that way. Mabel told Tony that nobody knew any better, and in her mind made firm plans that she would make Taos her home for the rest of her life. She really was, it seems, falling in love with Tony, and not for the things that he said, but for the things that he didn't say. Mabel wrote often in her memoirs about the bond that she and Tony shared, how she could understand the meanings of his oddly worded sayings and know what he was thinking simply through a look. There was a pause before Tony said, quote, "You threw away the roses I bring you." Knowing exactly what Tony meant, Mabel shrieked, "Oh, Tony, excuse me!" and began to apologize profusely. Tony accepted, and Mabel noted that Tony had an authoritarian air about him, like that of a school teacher, and she liked it. Mm-hmm. My wife is a school teacher. I like it too. Now, Mabel and Tony seem to have silently agreed on something, as shortly after this, Mabel bought a sizable piece of land that Tony had been telling her about and hired Tony, along with his crew of skilled contractors, to build her adobe house that they called Los Gallos. Upon hearing the news, Maurice was understandably upset. He had no intention of staying in Taos and was quite looking forward to heading back to New York in August. Mabel told Maurice that she was planning to stay there and that he could go back to New York if he wanted to. To this, Maurice was both saddened and dismayed. Not only was he saddened to hear his wife's indifference to his departure, but if he were to leave, I should say, he would be destitute. Remember that until now, Maurice had been relying solely on Mabel's income to keep himself afloat. Mm-hmm. According to Mabel, however, after this interaction, she rushed off to the Pueblo to meet Tony, telling him that all had been agreed upon with Maurice, and gave Tony the go-ahead to order all the supplies needed for the building of her new house. Mm-hmm. Now, you might be wondering why Maurice didn't just pack up immediately to head for New York. It's a good question. Remember, Maurice had begun to sculpt while in New Mexico, and had planned on completing 2 sculptures, the first of Pete Marcus, and then a second of, I believe, Pete Marcus's daughter, but maybe wife, I'm not 100% sure on that, whose name is Albidia. And Maurice did not want to leave before finishing them. He guessed he would be finished around August, but he wasn't sure. His departure could not come soon enough for Mabel. In an attempt to accelerate his work, Maurice moved up to a deserted mining town called Twinning with both Peter and Albidia, where he could work in peace. Work on Mabel's new house, Los Gallos, was chugging along nicely, and she began to feel as if she was truly at home. All her previous places didn't really count. Her various apartments were just spaces to live. The villa was Edwin's, technically. She just supplied the furniture. Finney Farms at Croton-on-Hudson, that was more for the Duncans. But this place was different. This place was all her own, and in a world where she felt she belonged and was accepted. Mabel's new plot of land sat just outside the edge of the Pueblo land, tucked just up against the mountains. The house was to be built on top of an existing adobe house, close to the Acequia Madre, I think I'm pronouncing that right, which is an agricultural ditch that ran through the Pueblo and was originally planned to have only 1 room added to it. So initially her house was not going to be gigantic. We will see ourselves later on. It's a big ol' house. Now, every day, Tony and his crew would work on building Mabel's new home, and every day Mabel would drop by to see the progress and to say hello to Tony. Of course. On one of these visits, Mabel arrived wearing one of her flowing white gowns from her days in Italy. Upon seeing Tony and Mabel together, one of Tony's workers, Antonio Martinez, made a remark to Tony in their native tongue. Mabel asked Tony what Antonio had said. Tony replied, quote, "He said, like a bride." Needless to say, Mabel's heart just about fluttered out of her chest. On another visit, Tony picked up a stick and began to draw some floor plans for Mabel. He traced out a big area and said, quote, "Here, I want a big enough place to put a big bed in." With this comment, Mabel had to go take some time alone to cool off under the shade of a nearby tree.
Okay, but let's remember, he's married and she's married.
Uh-huh.
Oh.
Scandal. She did occasionally drop in on Maurice to see if his work was coming along nicely, but seemed to find the construction of her house to be much more fascinating. Now, despite Mabel's growing love and attraction towards Tony, there were still gaps in their relationship that Mabel could not understand, or were just extremely difficult to get around. Tony, for one, was not convinced that Mabel was there to stay for the long run, and made it known to her. Tony also didn't completely trust Mabel yet, and much of Tony's world was still a mystery to her. One day, Mabel arrived at the Pueblo to find something of a ghost town. The doors were shut tight, the windows were covered, and hardly anyone was around, save for 2 or 3 tribespeople that would not acknowledge Mabel's presence. Ignoring the signs that maybe now isn't the best time, Mabel started banging on Tony and Calendaria's door, but nobody answered. She eventually left, but in the following days would hound Tony for an answer to the mystery. At first, Tony said he was asleep. Asleep? Said Mabel. At 11 a.m.? Tony sighed and reluctantly told her that he was going to trust her with something, but she couldn't share it with anyone, as most white people wouldn't understand. Tony then reached into his pocket and retrieved a small pouch. He uncinched the pouch, which revealed to Mabel an all too familiar sight. Peyote! She gasped in shock. Tony tried to explain, saying that for his people, it was actually a part of their religion, which they had adopted from their cousin tribe in Oklahoma. To them, peyote was a god, and a very powerful one at that. Tony said, quote, "He cure people. He give us songs. He show us wonderful thing like colors we never see before. Some people see God. Once, Enrique see Jesus." Which is my favorite line ever. Mabel wasn't having any of it, probably remembering what had happened to her friend Genevieve back in New York, and told Tony it was a terrible thing. Tony, however, stood his ground, saying that Mabel had probably used it wrong, which is
Probably
very fair. He suggested that Mabel accompany the tribe up to the Blue Lake in the mountains, where every year the tribe would gather around July to hold a ceremony. Maurice was invited too, but decided not to come. The ride to Blue Lake was 22 miles, but very rough terrain, so the group had to make the journey in 3 legs. By night 1 of the journey, after a downpour of rain, Mabel fell ill, apparently having to, quote, venture out into the woods many times during the night.
Uh-oh.
If you know what I mean.
Yep.
We all been there, right?
Yep.
On night 2, Tony dropped by to give Mabel some medicine. She was fairly confident that Tony was slipping her some peyote, but she figured she would trust Tony and give it a shot. Turns out, it worked like gangbusters, and she felt better immediately and went on for pages in her memoir talking about just how great the experience was, saying that during this experience she felt, quote, an expansion of the consciousness, and that the whole universe fell into place.
Huh.
In writing about this, she became the first woman in history to write about a psychedelic experience.
Interesting.
Freaking cool, right?
Yeah.
Little else of note happened during the trip, but it is worth noting that Mabel brought with her a small teepee for the journey, and when she arrived back home, asked Tony to set it up in her garden. A few months passed by, and soon autumn arrived. In the final few pages of her book, Edge of Taos Desert, Mabel writes that Maurice was still in town, splitting his time between Twinning and Taos, and though she didn't necessarily want him out of the picture completely, she did seem to at least be eager for a break. Rather than sitting around town where Maurice could potentially bring her down from her high, Mabel decided to accompany Tony and some other members of the tribe on a prolonged tour to visit some of the neighboring communities and stop by Santo Domingo to see the corn dance, which is, to my knowledge, still happening to this day, by the way.
Awesome.
Naturally, the car broke down several times and the trip ended up taking several weeks rather than the projected 8 or so days. When Mabel arrived back at her home in Taos, she found that Maurice had packed up all his belongings and left without so much as saying goodbye or leaving a note.
Ooh.
In her excitement, Mabel ran to the Pueblo to meet Tony. She found him sitting under the shade of a willow tree and said, quote, Maurice is gone. Tony simply nodded, but did not say anything else about it. The two then got to talking in the shade about Mabel's recent experience with peyote, and despite her positive reaction, she was still afraid of it and said she didn't want it to be a part of her life. If she and Tony were to be together, would Tony give it up? It's never made clear as to whether Tony says yes or no to giving up peyote altogether, but in my personal opinion, I don't think Tony would have given it up completely.
I don't think he would have.
I just don't.
It's not like he was doing peyote daily or anything.
No, and it seems like he was very respectful with it and used it as a part of his like religious ceremonies. I personally think that Mabel saying no more of that, I don't think she had a leg to stand on. I think it was borderline like
ultimatum.
Dare I say offensive?
Yeah, no, yeah.
It's like if you were a religious person of any kind and you said, "Hey, don't believe in your God anymore." It's like, that's not cool to say that to somebody, you know? So I don't think he would have given that up.
It's not like he was walking around like having a tripping like constantly.
No, nor do I think that Mabel was so offended by it and hated it so much that she would have let it affect anything. I think it was pretty much after that, it was like, all right, whatever, he's going to do it sometimes. So, okay. Now, the two then spent the rest of the day at the building site of her soon-to-be new home, Los Gallos. When the sun began to set, Mabel started to head back home, but Tony stopped her. He said, quote, "I come in here to this teepee tonight when darkness here. That be right?" Mabel softly replied, "Yes, Tony, that be right." This would mark the first time that Mabel and Tony would spend the night together. At least, that's what Mabel says. Once again, Maurice tells an entirely different tale.
Hold up. He wasn't there.
Well, according to Mabel's story, he wasn't there. Okay, and according to Mabel, she went on a trip and came back and he was gone. Here's Maurice's story.
Okay.
Yes. So, again, Maurice, very different tale. According to him, Mabel had been having an affair with Tony for months prior to his departure from Taos. He first became suspicious when, months earlier, Mabel had gone for an afternoon ride with Tony, a regular occurrence, so Maurice initially thought little of it. But on this occasion, Mabel arrived hours late, with a look on her face that said, "Light me up a cigarette, I'm in a very good mood." A look that Maurice had seen many times before. This is quite possibly the night that Maurice hit Mabel. He says he never hit her. Literally a he said, she said situation. Maurice also claimed that when Mabel came back from the Blue Lake trip and had Tony set up the teepee in the garden, they began to use it as their secret rendezvous spot.
Doesn't seem like so secret.
Well, it was far enough that apparently it would take like 5 or some odd minutes to walk from the house
like
to
right
the teepee.
Okay.
Right. It
was far.
Yeah, exactly. Now I lost my spot. Maurice describes the nightly ritual that occurred for months. First, Tony would ride his horse out to their house, build a fire, and do a song and dance performance while banging a drum, and then wait for the fire to die down to coals. Next, Mabel and Maurice would crawl into bed, and Maurice would pretend to fall asleep. Once Mabel believed him to be good and conked out, she would sneak out of the house to meet Tony in the teepee for an hour or so, and then sneak back in, trying to ease back into bed as carefully as possible. Maurice was awake the entire time, and could also hear, quite well, the sound of a single horse and rider galloping away into the night. Maurice was an artist, however, so the best he could really bring himself to do was fantasize about taking his revenge in some kind of grand cowboy shootout, and ended up borrowing an old revolver from, who else but Arthur Mansby?
Of course.
Who apparently upon giving the gun to Maurice said, "I hope you'll fast on the draw." Remember, he's from England. Maurice never did use the revolver, but did become sickened with the thought that if Arthur Mansby knew of Mabel's infidelity, the entire town knew. One night, Mabel was following her usual routine, sneaking out of the house and into the garden teepee. Maurice lay in bed, simmering with jealousy and anger. However, this time, Maurice noted that there was no song and dance routine from Tony, nor did he hear any kind of eventual sounds of horse hooves clomping up to their house. Tony had not come. After a shorter than usual time period, he heard the door creak open, followed by Mabel trying to tiptoe her way back into the house. After she settled in bed, Maurice could only contain his mixture of rage and comedic sense for the situation for a few minutes before he sarcastically whined, "Poor Mabel, poor Mabel. Her lover doesn't show up and she has to go to bed without her nightcap." Mabel flew into a rage and tried to kick Maurice out, to which he replied, quote, "This is my bed. You go back to your own tent." Which I love.
Was that who put that? Was that in his writings or
this
her?
Is Maurice's writings.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
This is according to him.
Yes,
This is what happened.
This is his writings.
Now, with this, Maurice claims she started to attack him physically, which led to a small struggle, ultimately leading to Mabel being pushed out of bed and landing on the floor with a thud.
But that floor is hard too.
Floor is hard. Maurice maintains that this was the only physically violent altercation the two ever had, and that this was possibly the source of Mabel's claim that he struck her across the face. Again, we don't know the real truth, so it's possible that one is lying or that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Again, we don't really know. Maurice says that it was because of this incident that he left for the abandoned mining town of Twining the next morning, as he was hell-bent on finishing his sculptures before heading back east, regardless of Mabel's actions. He did finish his sculptures, but in his haste to complete them and get back home, he made his second sculpture of Albidia almost completely out of wax, rather than a plaster core. And when he finally left in August, he found upon unboxing his sculpture in New York that the entire thing had melted.
Okay, come on, man.
I know. Quite understandably, with what remained, he hacked apart with a hatchet.
Yeah.
Although their relationship was over, Mabel did support Maurice financially for the next few years in the form of a $100 a month allowance, kind of like a voluntary alimony, until Maurice was able to get back on his feet and the divorce was finalized. In those few years of financial support, Maurice moved on and lived with Elizabeth Duncan at her newest school, which was at Terrytown on Hudson, where he fell in love with a dancing student. Yes, she was 15 at the time, and yes, her family was upset, but she, the dance student, wrote of the events herself and does say it was she who pursued Maurice and described herself as a precocious young girl who studied Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. All I can say is different times. The two spent the rest of their lives together, though, eventually marrying and settling in Italy, where Maurice, due to some physical ailments, switched from painting and sculpting to writing. He wrote later that Mabel's description of him and their relationship did hurt him, but he eventually got over it. He wrote of his time with Mabel and the Tiwa tribe, quote, "Part of the problem was that Mabel had always been enthralled by the mystical. She thought that she had finally found what she had been looking for in Tony and the Indian mystique. As soon as she discovered the Pueblo Indians, she was like someone under hypnosis. Most of all, their silence fascinated her. But I must admit that practically, the only words I heard them say myself were, 'I'll have more chicken.'" He cannot get over that. A single roast chicken, this guy cannot get over. He had one lunch where some people ate his chicken, and he forever is, I don't want to say racist because I don't think that's fair, but he definitely had some prejudice against the natives moving forward from his chicken.
I wonder if it was the natives or if it was like from the get-go, Tony was after his wife. He was out in the Pueblo, like he was doing all this stuff, and the whole thing was a negative experience, and it's sarcasm. Like, That's fair. The thing is, he was right. Everything that he was suspecting, it was all true. It was all happening. So, there's only so much you can do to keep your tongue.
I just think it's funny that after spending, it was at least a year, probably a year and a half to 2 years, this guy in Taos, right? The only positive thing that he could bring himself to say about the native peoples was that they would say, "I want more chicken." It's like so gross. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I don't know. There's just something. He may have been right about, Mabel cheating, but it just seems like it translated into this prejudice that
I don't know.
It's weird. And it's such a strange thing to just be like, you ate my chicken. Now I don't like you. Whatever. Anyway, moving on. The year was now 1919 and Mabel was free To be fair, Mabel seems to have lived a fairly free life prior to this, but she was now truly free. She was now in an exotic new land, surrounded by an ancient culture, and had her eyes set on Tony. She describes her feelings for Tony and how, much like her new feelings of freedom, Tony too felt like something new. He wasn't like any of the other men she had been with previously. Tony, in her mind, was free too. Free from the constraints of modern society, free to think and believe what he wanted, and free to love who he wanted. Seemingly in line with this newfound sense of freedom, Mabel initially had no intention of marrying Tony. There was some initial scandalous gossip that went on around Taos when Maurice left, and it became an open secret that Mabel and Tony were lovers. Mabel claims again that nothing occurred between her and Tony up until that point. In fact, the gossip around town only seemed to remind and reinforce in Mabel the notion that she just didn't care. She had enough money to not care what anybody thought about her. In equal fairness, the community at the Pueblo also seemed to be buzzing with gossip about Mabel and Tony as well, and there was even a persistent rumor that Mabel was renting Tony.
Interesting.
This rumor didn't exactly get snuffed out over time, as Mabel slowly and carefully made negotiations with Tony's wife, Calendaria, to pay her to leave him. Calendaria did accept the money. Calendaria accepted the money and used it to help her family, but the result of this payment was that Tony was now forbidden from participating in the tribal council.
Ooh.
Undoubtedly a tough blow for Tony.
Yeah.
This his whole life. Now, with all this change, Mabel found herself feeling restless with the desire to get out of Taos for a while, a common occurrence for her that she would repeat for the rest of her life. We're not going to talk about it a ton in the next episode, but just kind of know that throughout all of her remaining years, it was probably every year or so she would go on a trip somewhere, whether it was California or New York or something. She was constantly restless and moving around.
I mean, that's fine. If I had
That's awesome.
lot of money, I mean, people go on vacation, like people
Totally.
do stuff, like I would be doing exactly what she's doing, like
No
have
judgment.
your home base and go see the world.
Totally. Yeah, zero judgment. Just saying that for the sake of, she wasn't constantly in Taos. It wasn't like she was there every day for 30 straight years. She would leave for months at a time and all that stuff and then come on back. All right, now where were we? She decided a trip back to New York would suit her nicely, so in April of 1919, she packed a few bags and headed to the East Coast. Not long after arriving in town, Mabel was taken to see an occultist named Mrs. Lotus Dudley to get her fortune taken and see what the spirit world might have to say about her new life. Upon sitting down with Mabel and reading her energy, Mrs. Lotus Dudley told her that since the beginning of the earliest civilizations on Earth, there existed a mystic set of beliefs that certain races have possessed, passed along, and kept alive through the centuries. This set of beliefs, said Mrs. Lotus Dudley, was currently being kept alive by the people of the Taos Pueblo, and that it was the psychic key, quote-unquote, to nirvana on Earth, and that Taos was the beating heart of everything. Mrs. Lotus went on. She told Mabel that this secret, mystic set of beliefs would one day, not long from now, be revealed to the masses, and that, quote, a bridge will be needed between the Indian and white people, and you have been chosen to be that bridge. Mrs. Lotus said that Taos was to be the place of a new birth for Western civilization, and that, quote, all the great souls will be drawn there. Lastly, Mrs. Lotus gave Mabel an order, saying, quote, you are not to fail, for there is a cosmic purpose you are to fulfill. With this, Mabel went back to Taos with a new sense of purpose in aiding to preserve the ways and custom of the Taos Pueblo people and save them from extinction. She wrote of this event later by saying, quote, was I not specifically prepared for some great cosmic purpose? Which is a very Mabel thing to say.
Okay, I want to sit on this for talk about this for a second, because, you know, I don't know definitively if people can really talk to spirits, or I don't know for sure. That I can't guarantee that, like, she didn't have some sort of message shared to Mabel through her that was like, you were in the right place at the right time. But also, if you think about like The Secret, like putting it out in the universe and then the things come to you, it's really interesting that this random psychic in New York that she goes to go see, I mean, I'm sure that Mabel walks in and she says, well, I've been in Taos and I've been doing this and I'd like to know about what this is. Because then this woman has all the information she needs to tell her the story that she wants to hear, which is part of what a good psychic can do. Because there is scientific evidence that when people have a purpose or know something that's supposed to be told, or they're getting told that what they're doing is the right thing, they're better. It's like it facilitates them to actually go achieve the thing.
I can see that.
And so it's interesting to me because maybe woo, like Mabel was the person that was supposed to go and do this stuff. Maybe all of this was leading up to this point. And in one mindset you can think that she also had the means, which is helpful. And maybe that's why she was the chosen person to do this, because she had the means partially, and the personality and the experience and the open mind and all the things. It's interesting though too, because this woman could have been anybody and she chose to tell the story of like, you're doing the thing that is good, keep doing it. Some other psychic down the road could have been like, oh no, like you need to come here and see me weekly.
Now,
like
I will say that this whole story is another one of those according to Mabel stories. I'm not going to call her a liar because I don't know. It could be totally true that this is all accurate.
I mean,
but what I will
on brand
say
for her to go see a psychic.
What I will say though is that it got me curious, and I started looking around to see if there was any mention anywhere of any doctor, or pardon me, Mrs. Lotus. What was it, Dudley? Yeah, Mrs. Lotus Dudley. The only mention of her that I could find anywhere is literally, she was the one that told Mabel. That's like her claim to fame. I'm not saying that it invalidates the story. It's just one of those where, again, I just tend to get this impression with Mabel throughout her life. There was a lot of wishful thinking there. And I just question if this actually happened.
I think it probably happened. But I think it could have been because did you ever watch The Mentalist?
No. Oh, that was the show. No,
it's
I never watched that.
It's pretty good. But like the way that, some people maintain that psychics are real and some people maintain that they are just really good at reading you and telling you things that you want to hear. So where I'm going with this again is
maybe she was just new.
She just talked to the right person who had you're doing the right thing, because a lot of people that are in that line of work might be self-serving in a way that says, you need to come back and see me. We need to have a monthly recurring subscription here, And so this woman could have been like, oh no, this is wrong. It's all your aura is off. You need to come back to New York. It's not safe. Yeah. You need to come to me and see me weekly. So it's interesting that she did encourage her.
Yeah.
Because it could have very easily gone a different way. And I don't know that if it had gone a different way, Mabel would have necessarily followed through with that advice. But it's just an interesting thing.
I agree. You could be very well, right. I really don't know.
I believe that she definitely saw a psychic, whether she embellished the name or whatever.
I believe that.
But when you go see psychics, they tell you what you're coming to ask about a lot of the time. I've seen a couple.
So you're saying it could have been less about an actual mystical presence guiding her so much as a really good reader that was like, let me give you the information that I know will make you
feel good.
Yeah,
because they don't
live the life you want to live. Or
I
whatever.
mean, a lot of times if you go see someone and they're telling you doom and gloom and everything, that's not good either, because you're never going to come back. Like,
true.
I mean, unless she just comes in and it's the kind of person that seems like they want to hear doom and gloom, but I don't think Mabel was that person. No. So I don't know. It's interesting. Or maybe it was all divine and really truly what it is. And I don't know if there's a specific mystic language that is being carried by Native Americans in the United States or anybody specifically or not. I don't know for sure that, but hey, you know what? It sure seems like whatever it was,
put her into a good direction.
It put her in the right direction.
And as we're going to see here, whether or not it was true, that exact thing happened or whatever, it almost doesn't matter, because the stuff that came out of it is pretty awesome.
I mean, that's the thing. It's just like placebo effect in drugs.
Right.
Like you could be given you're in the clinical trial for the thing and you get the placebo, but you still see improvement because you believe you're getting medication.
Totally.
It doesn't actually matter because the mind is a powerful thing.
Yes, it is. Now, once back in Taos, Mabel became increasingly obsessed with the conditions of the pueblo and the surrounding areas, obviously in accordance to her new charge. After spending a significant amount of time there and hearing the complaints of the tribe, Mabel started to write regularly to Washington, discovering who was in charge of what and who she could contact to help improve conditions. If you'll remember,
she's in trouble with them.
Had already had an exchange with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, so she was perpetually suspicious of the department. It went two ways. It wasn't just that they were looking at her. She was looking at them, going, who are you? What are you guys all about? Now, I'm just going to tell everybody right now, buckle up. We're going to get into some history. Okay. And it's going to be probably about 100 years of worth of history in like 5 minutes, if not less.
Let me crack my
put
knuckles.
on your thinking caps here, okay? Now, we're going to get into some political history that involves the United States government and the tribal nations of America. I will just say up front, I am going to give an overview here. I know that there is so much more to discuss on this topic, and we could probably do an entire podcast show, not even just a series, about the political history of Native Americans and the United States government. That being said, just know all I'm trying to do is provide a little bit of context as to why this information is relevant to Mabel's story moving forward. So again, bit of history. Not long after the establishment of the United States government, there was talk as to how the tribes of America should be given land. Initially, the proposal was to put all tribes together in one massive reservation, but given that not all tribes got along, that plan soon turned into 3 big reservations. That wasn't any good either, so eventually they decided on a whole bunch of small reservations. And in 1803, Thomas Jefferson signed over to the Native American tribes all of the Louisiana Purchase north of the Arkansas River, which was supposed to never be given to any whites.
Interesting. And do you have like the geographic area of what that is in the states today?
Yeah, the Louisiana Purchase is basically the Mississippi River Divide and all the way to the west.
Okay, so basically Mississippi,
almost
west
all the
of
way
the
to the west.
Mississippi.
Almost all the way. There was some that at that point was, I think, either Mexico or what was considered Calexico. But if you look onto the map at what the Louisiana Purchase was, I mean, it is basically...
It was big, I remember.
It is, if you think of a cone going from the south of the United States at Louisiana and basically going vertical on the right side of the cone and then way over to the left on the left side of the cone, like it is a massive hunk of land that we bought from the French.
We would be there.
Anybody doesn't
we would
know that.
be in Colorado.
I believe
think so.
I think it was part of the Louisiana Purchase. But yeah, that
didn't
was...
mean to put you on the spot. Keep going.
No, that's okay. But at the time, if anybody doesn't know this, that land was owned by the French, which is where we get all that French influence from in Louisiana, and we bought all that land from them. So, 1803, Thomas Jefferson signed over, again, all of that land north of the Arkansas. So if you look at the Arkansas, it's basically half of the Louisiana Purchase. It's huge. Lots and lots and lots of land. Now, surprise, surprise, in 1843, this plan was dramatically altered, land size was reduced, and the U.S. government appointed a superintendent of Indian Affairs. Given that the new superintendent was now the gatekeeper of trade between white settlers and the tribes, corruption often followed. In 1849, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was redesignated to the Department of the Interior. Tribal affairs in general previously were designated to the War Department.
Interesting.
Up until 1843. How crazy is that? In 1849, the Bureau of Indian Affairs... Oh, no, that was 1849, pardon me. That's what I just said. Not 1843. Okay. Even with this new designation, no power was given to the tribes, as the President of the United States was the sole person responsible for appointing Indian agents who acted more or less as representatives to one or more tribes, depending on the size. This led to common political dramas, but in the form of proxy politics, in that the white agents would play politics against the other white agents on behalf of the tribes. So really, really complicated situation. These agents, along with the president, wielded sole power over all law and trade with the native tribes of the Americas up until 1871, when Congress took over. As you can probably imagine, this was not a good thing either. In 1876, the Supreme Court ruled that the Pueblo tribes were not wards of the government, which opened up the land for purchase and squatting. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which effectively tried to whitewash the tribes by granting them land allotments under the condition that they take up agriculture and adopt Western white ways, and even pushing them to abandon their native religions. In order for a Native American person to do this, they also needed to abandon their tribe, but this came with the promise of citizenship. In 1913, the Supreme Court ruling was reversed, but that led to confusion over existing squatter and buyer's rights regarding the land. When Warren G. Harding was elected president in 1921, he appointed a man named Albert B. Fall, who was a senator representing New Mexico, as head of the Department of the Interior. It was then, in 1921, the Bursum Bill popped up, introduced by Holm Bursum, senator from New Mexico, championed by Albert B. Fall himself, along with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. See, oil had been discovered on Navajo land.
Of course.
And Albert Fall had authorized for it to be drilled, even though it was not the U.S. government's land to drill on. The Bursum Bill, if passed, would effectively transfer all ownership of the Pueblo lands from the tribespeople to the white squatters that were currently there. The white squatters could then sell it back to the U.S. government, making all of this actively legal. Even worse, this bill was kept highly secret. None of the tribespeople were made aware of its existence by the Senate, nor did they have any idea that the bill existed. Thankfully, we had Mabel Dodge Luhan. Prior to any of the Bursum Bill stuff happening, Mabel, in accordance with her charge by Mrs. Lotus Dudley, had been furiously writing to her various friends of old to come visit her out in Taos. Among these friends was a man whom Mabel had known for a long time since her days in New York, a man named John Collier. Mabel had been begging John Collier to come visit her in Taos all throughout 1919, and it was in the winter of 1920 that John and his family finally accepted. John Collier was a sociologist, writer, social reformer, and Native Americans' rights activist who would eventually go on to serve as the commissioner for the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the presidential administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt from 1933 to 1945, and created what would be known as the Indian New Deal.
Okay.
John Collier became known to American history as, quote, the greatest of all Indian commissioners. Quick aside, I don't know John Collier's full background, so it's entirely possible if I dive into the actual political history, there may have been some less than great things that were introduced lawfully at that time, but suffice it to say, John Collier, from what I have researched, truly had a heart for the Native people of America and really did try his absolute best to do as much as he possibly could for them. So I think in general, John Collier is seen as at least a favorable figure in history. If anybody out there is like, nope, turns out he was a monster, let me know. I don't know everything.
I mean, I've never heard of him, which means he probably wasn't that much of a monster because he would have been glossed over in the history that you and I learned growing up.
True.
Probably.
And as we're going to see here in a second, he basically is the main reason that the Bursum Bill gets squashed, which is pretty cool. So, because of Mabel's insistence that John Collier come to Taos, he and his family ended up spending nearly 25 years of their life there. Because John lived in Taos and had such a passion for and keen pulse on Native American rights, he was fully aware of the Bursum Bill and how detrimental it would be to the tribes. So not only did John tell every tribesperson that would listen, he had an overview of the bill translated and analyzed into Tenoan, Tewan, Carician, and Zunian, all the languages of the Pueblo peoples, and made sure all of the elders heard and understood. John then helped form the Council of All New Mexican Pueblos, which first met on November 22nd, 1922, who organized a delegation of tribespeople to campaign throughout Washington in opposition of the Bursum Bill. After much opposition, at last, a motion to dismiss the bill was introduced by William Borah of Idaho, and the Bursum Bill was dead. A bit happily, Albert B. Fall, the man who basically charged and spearheaded the entire thing, was eventually arrested and found guilty of bribery and corruption charges in 1929 due to the infamous Teapot Dome scandal, which was another big oil corruption case, and died in obscurity and disgrace in 1944. Obviously, there is a lot more to the story of tribal rights in New Mexico and America, but I would argue that for this small win, had Mabel not been where she was when she was, John Collier would not have been in a position to be an advocate for the Native American tribes. In fact, he was on his way to Mexico with plans to live there for 10 years, but was persuaded to come to Taos by Mabel. This would become a continued behavior for Mabel for the rest of her life, constantly writing to Washington to fight for Native rights. Now, from Mabel's standpoint, during all of this, she didn't quite seem to see the looming threat to her life in Taos that the U.S. government was posing, at least not just yet. As mentioned previously, most of her energy was being put towards persuasive letters attempting to woo her friends to New Mexico. Her primary target was in a man she had never met, a literary prodigy who is considered to be among the best and brightest of the new generation, whose work had already begun to spark outrage and controversy. A man Mabel described as, quote, being able to really see this Taos country and the Indians, and who can describe it so that it is as much alive between the covers of a book as it is in relation. A man who had come to define a huge portion of Mabel's life and be a source of some of her most infamous writings. A man named D.H. Lawrence. And that's where we're going to pick it up for the conclusion.
The conclusion.
Of Mabel Dodge Luhan.
The gripping conclusion.
Now, before we fully end out the episode, I had a couple corrections I wanted to make that I spotted myself in my own readings.
Okay.
So first is that in episode 2, I listed Mabel's piece for the Armory show. Remember, it was about Gertrude Stein. I listed it as speculations or post-impressions in prose. And then I commented on how pretentious that was and how I didn't like it. The correct title is actually speculations or post-impressionism in prose. Oh. Which I think is way less pretentious and is not nearly as bad of a title. I mean, speculations or post-impressionism in prose? Oh, okay, I get that. That actually makes sense. So anyways, just wanted to throw that out there. And then the other one was that I made some offhanded comment about Jim Crow laws that were like just coming into existence at like the turn of the 19th century. That is completely false. Those started around the mid 1800s and progressed over time through various forms in different states. So just wanted to throw that out there. That wasn't the case. Those had been in existence for at least 20 or 30 years prior to that. But as of now, those are the two corrections that I was able to at least myself spot. So I wanted to throw those out there.
Thanks.
Yeah.
As a former journalist, I guess, because that's what my degree was in. You know, the print corrections.
Yeah, totally.
It's the same thing.
Oh, that was a saga today.
It was a saga.
I know. We had peyote conversations. We had Mabel tripping out on peyote.
Well, and the other thing that I had been thinking the whole episode, and then you kind of explained it a little bit indirectly, was a lot of these people you've been talking about that are from these tribes have like American English names. Yeah. And after you went through the whole thing about like them having to basically give up the tribe and like that's where their names from. And obviously people are in places like, you know, you're going to have people that came up from Mexico and have those names and things like that. So I can see how it could be all mixed up. But I was like, how did this guy get to be named Tony? And then the one who Mabel's husband was sculpting his bust, like had like a very So you have to think about it. I'm sure it's a combination of two things. Is that one, it's, I think absolutely what you just said. It's a tale as old as time. It's still happening today. I mean, there have been times that I've interacted with folks that are in, Vietnam and they're like, hi, my name's Sam. And I'm like, I know it's not, but I appreciate your effort. Yeah. Sort of, I guess. Even though, for those people out there, if you're listening to this, just say what your real name is. In America, we can pronounce names. We're not that dumb. Like, we can do it. So, be cool. But in this case, though, the other thing that's important to remember is two things. One is the influence from Mexico, and then two, the influence of the Catholic Church. So, Tony, his name was Antonio. So, pretty traditional. Still a little bit,
yeah. Exactly. Kind of more or less Mexican Spanish name. That's where it's coming from. But the name's like Peter. Well, that's, Paul, Peter, Mark, John, biblical. All those dudes or whatever, right?
Biblical.
So Yeah, that's all it is.
Well,
I think
and you mentioned that he said it's one time so and so saw Jesus.
Enrique.
So like, yeah, Enrique saw Jesus. So just the same thing of like, okay, well, our gods and but also Jesus is a guy, like, just,
totally.
Anyway, so but at first I was kind of thinking like, yeah, a lot of these names are not like, I don't know. And she wasn't like the first person who went to Taos. Like this wasn't like, people were there that were Western. It's weird when you say Westerners, but then like, I mean, that's not what I mean. Just like, the white people, the white folks
Them white
coming
folks.
out. So, but yeah, I just was finding it funny that those names were not.
I agree. It's the Pete
more
really did throw me off too.
Yeah.
Tony, I think, is really funny that he goes by Tony because Tony to me feels so much more like an Italian name.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
It's like you don't expect this guy.
Hey, Tony.
Hey, Tony, how you doing, buddy? Yeah.
That's where I was. So Antonio, yes, but like I was thinking Italian as well. And I know he'd been traveling and had been in a show too, so he was around people. So was that his given name at birth?
I think so.
Okay.
I'm fairly confident. I'm sure it was. Yeah, I'm 99%.
No one ever said anything about it being anything else. So,
Oh, and also as an aside, I never mentioned this, but if anybody out there ever reads, I'm sure you're gonna have to read her name, Mabel Dodge Luhan. If you're listening to this episode, it's literally gonna be on your phone. You'll notice that her last name is spelled Luhan. Tony's was Lujan. And Mabel specifically changed it because people phonetically couldn't figure it out. They'd be like Lujan, and she'd be like Luhan, and so she changed it just to be easier for Americans. So again, tale as old as time. We've been changing these names around to accommodate us for forever.
Yeah,
apparently.
Well, I mean, and I think you and I are like, that's cool. We got it. Like you don't need to do that for us. But there are a lot of people around who are not like that.
Especially at that point in time.
Yeah.
As well.
Yes. Exactly. 100 years ago. So.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for this episode. I'm realizing now at the very end that you and I never said hello, welcome to the Biographers at the beginning of this episode. I assume you all knew. You listened to the intro. So I didn't feel like I would have to do it again. But these are just habits I think I need to get into.
Hello. Welcome to the Biographers.
And then also goodbye because we're about to be done.
Goodbye from the Biographers.
Yeah, okay. I guess that's going to be it. As always, tune in next time. Love to have you as listeners again. Any questions you got for us, shoot us an email at thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com. And then otherwise, check us out on the web, biographerspodcast.com, and listen to us anywhere you can, and tell your friends. We need more listeners. Because the more that you listen and the more friends you get to listen, the closer that we can get to doing this full time. And we don't have to do our other jobs anymore. So
we love our other jobs. They're
great. Hey, other jobs, if you guys are listening at our other jobs, we love you and we're grateful for the work that we have there. But I got dreams, baby. I got dreams.
Oh yeah. What if this were a full-time job? Whoa.
Yeah, dude. That's what I'm saying. Dreams.
Or when this is, if we use the secret to pull that back.
Or if we just hearken back to Mrs. Lotus Dudley and just pretend that she's speaking to us, she would tell us that this is the goal.
We are in the right place at the right time.
We
and
have been chosen to read biographies and do other research and then tell other people about them via podcast.
Very well.
This is a calling.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.